Governments and administrations go about their business regardless of whether they have our consent or not.
All they have to say is it's illegal in Australia to vote twice.
It's like driverless cars, right? People think, oh, it's all the rage, it's going to be great. Well, what happens if it freezes up because it doesn't know what to do? What happens if there's a system failure, right? I mean, mechanical things fail.
Welcome to the Aussie Wire. Before we get to the news today, make sure that you've joined the Aussie Wire's email list at theaussiewire.com so that we can contact you even if we're cancelled on social media. We are at the moment on another YouTube ban, and given that we don't back down from the truth, we're likely to get cancelled off YouTube and who knows how many other platforms in the near future. So be sure to get onto our email list so that we can contact you no matter what happens on social media. Also, be sure to read our blogs while you're there. We have articles from myself, from Rebecca Barnett, from Crystal Mitchell, from Joanne Nova, and Alex Story will be soon appearing with guest blogs as well. So be sure to check out our blog while you're there signing up for our email list. And finally, I'm jumping on a plane very early tomorrow morning to head over to Adelaide to speak at the Church and State Conference in Adelaide. Grab your ticket via the link in the description and use the code TOFA10 for a 10% discount off your tickets. Last I heard, there were less than 50 seats left, so I suggest you be quick. Now, here's the news. Well, depending on who you talk to, there is either a war on cash or there isn't. It's one of those areas where different people, it's almost like a Rorschach test. People look at it and see entirely different things whilst looking at exactly the same evidence. So I wanted to do some digging. And while I was digging, I came across a familiar name. And what she's done is very interesting. The familiar name is Professor Gigi Foster, Professor of Economics from the University of New South Wales. And I came across her in an article that was relevant to the research that I was doing. So I went, you know what? I'm not going to do an editorial on this. I'm going to get it right from Professor Gigi Foster's mouth. Professor, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on, Topher.
Look, it's always a pleasure, and I have the pleasure of joining you in Sydney in a couple of months' time for the launch of a very exciting project over there. I'll have to get you back on to talk about that closer to the time. Right now, let's talk about this push for a cashless society. Some people say that there is no push for a cashless society. It's just that people don't want it. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's certainly true that a lot of people these days feel they could do without cash, particularly in Australia. And there are some economies, very small ones, I must say, but some that have tried to go fully cashless. And there are arguments for at least using cash less, because it is quite efficient for a one-off transaction to be able to just tap your card instead of having to dig out cash. You can see the draw of that in the short run. But there is a lot of heterogeneity amongst Australian consumers. And so, in fact, if you ask the RBA, which I did a few months ago, whether or not people are still using cash, and if they are, does that matter to the RBA's policy, then you get a very enlightening answer. So people are using cash. Not everybody, and a lot of people are using it as a store of value, as we say, primarily, rather than as necessarily a medium of exchange. So what this means is people are hoarding cash. They're keeping cash in their mattresses. I mean, I've got a few $100 up there just on my desk, right? Just people have it hanging around. And so from that perspective, in a high inflation environment, it's not such a wise investment to have that as a, the main way you're storing your wealth, but to have a bit of a buffer for an emergency. Most people do use cash for that purpose at least. And of course, other people also use it a lot for transactions.
Of course. We'll come back to what the RBA said to you when you asked them a few months ago in just a moment. But first, I want to set the scene here, because this is a slightly fraught topic. There are people that are interpreting the evidence in very different ways. We had reports for a little while that a number of bank branches were going cashless, but that's not quite technically correct, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, so if you say the word cashless, often it kind of conjures up the idea that you can't anymore use cash at that facility. But in fact, what they mean when they say that a branch is going cashless is that they won't give you cash over the counter. If you want to make a withdrawal in cash, you simply are directed to the ATM, which is typically there, alongside the branch. And so there is still an availability of cash, but it's just not available from the warm body behind the counter.
Now, what's interesting is that the banks have taken to calling these sort of these branches with no over-the-counter cash transactions. They call them specialist centres, but I don't know about you, but I'd like my bank to specialise in giving me my money. That's kind of the number one specialty that I think my bank should have. It's also interesting, though, because the ultimate in a cashless bank branch would have to be a bank branch that doesn't exist. And what we are seeing is an awful lot of branches being shut down.
Yeah, that's very true. And that's really worrying. I mean, one of the things about cash that I really love, and I think we fail to highlight and emphasize enough, including to our kids, by the way, is that it is a very kind of equitable means of transacting. You don't have to have a savings account. You don't have to have a credit card. You don't have to have even a bank account of any sort in order to be able to accept and then use cash. So a homeless person on the street can accept donations in cash and use those donations to buy food. That means it's accessible to that person. And that makes a real difference in a society where we say we care about the plight of the disadvantaged. Well, the disadvantaged are not just disadvantaged economically, but financially as well, often in terms of their access to credit markets. So providing cash is a way of incorporating those people better into our economy.
Very true. Now, this is an interesting one. So there's been a lot of claims that shops are not allowed to refuse cash. Cash is legal tender. Legal tender must be accepted. We were chatting just before we came on air. Neither of us are aware of an actual court precedent on this. But the RBA and other sort of bodies that claim to know these things have come out with an opinion that is certainly not the one that I would have expected.
Yeah, no. So this idea that it matters how you're using your cash as to whether or not cash must be accepted is kind of a new concept. When I was growing up, certainly in the U.S., you would read the bills and it says, in God we trust, legal tender, right? And that's kind of, you think, okay, well, that's what we are talking about, legal tender for everything, no matter what you want to use this money for. But we were talking before, and you said apparently the RBA's interpretation is that cash is only required to be accepted by creditors who are fielding receipt of a debt, so a payment of a from somebody else, rather than necessarily for transactions in real time. So if I go to my local cafe, in fact, there is a cafe on campus at UNSW which says it doesn't take cash. I mean, I don't go there, right? But it has a sign that says it doesn't take cash. And I've often thought, well, how can that possibly be? How is this, the proprietor of this place not being challenged on that by people who would like to use cash? Of course, it's a very posh clientele that they have there on campus.
Sure.
Most people have bank accounts and they will have cards. And so they don't really they don't see the cost of giving up cash or disallowing cash in the moment.
And to be clear, I don't think this is how it should be, but my understanding of the RBA's argument is that in the Constitution, it specifically states that Australian money must be accepted in the payment of debts. And that appears to be the technicality that they're using to say, but that doesn't apply to transactions. If you're just buying something, it's not the payment of a debt. And so actually the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about that. Well, if someone were to challenge that in court, I think the High Court might come to a different decision than what the RBA is saying at the moment. But who's going to spend millions of dollars challenging that in the High Court?
That's exactly the problem. And this is a problem that actually, as an economist, I face a lot. I see a lot of situations where there's a clear policy direction that would benefit all of Australia, but very few individual people, if any, would have a personal incentive to actually really push for that policy, and particularly in the case of legal challenges. Here, the cost of that sort of legal challenge is just enormous compared to the marginal value that you get as one individual consumer of being able to use cash.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine a scenario, no matter how wealthy I got in some hypothetical future, I can't see a scenario where I would look at that and see that as worthwhile. But of course, all this is now against a backdrop of an increasing string, I would almost say, of FPOS outages. ANZ went down, Woolies went down. This is just in the last week. This isn't the first time we've seen these things happen. It won't be the last. The sight of Woolies stores putting up handwritten and very poorly spelled out, may I say, signs saying, I'm sorry, we're only accepting cash at the moment. Shouldn't this be an alarm bell for people?
Yeah, totally, Topher. I mean, this is a hilarious sort of thing. I have to laugh just because it's emblematic of the modern time we live in, right? There are so many situations, and not just in this area, so many situations I encounter every day in my work, for example, and many listeners of your show will as well, where a process that used to be pretty simple, where there was maybe a paper form or just, something written down, which would handle a problem, has now been superseded by some teched up bureaucratic solution, which involves the internet and involves, something working and browsers, latching onto things, or somebody's phone having charge or something technical. And there is a risk inbuilt in that. Right. I mean, it might fail. It's like driverless cars, right? People think, is all the rage is going to be great. Well, what happens if it freezes up because it doesn't know what to do? What happens if there's a system failure, right? I mean, mechanical things fail, and cash, kind of is just there. Yeah, it could go up in smoke. That's true. But, as with so many things, how about diversifying? If you diversify the different options you have, you're safer. It's a more robust, sort of healthier economy that gives multiple different options to suppliers and customers to pay for stuff and to shop at different places. I mean, the basic argument that we have for competition holds here as well. You want to have different opportunities to choose, well, would I like to use cash here or not? Because just in case there's an outage or there's a problem, maybe cash goes up in smoke, then you really want to use the FPOS, right? So why shut down options?
But also, I mean, electronic banking has brought in enormous benefits in the efficiency of making payments and doing business overseas, etc. No one that I'm aware of is arguing that we shouldn't have the ability to make electronic payments. It's this question now over, are we going to lose the ability to actually exchange legal tender, to exchange banknotes? Now, you mentioned at the very start of this interview that you've actually reached out to the RBA and had a bit of a chat with them about this. So what have they said about the future of cash? Do they have plans to phase it out, and what would the criteria be?
Yeah. So I was physically there actually in the Kirribilli branch because, as you know, the Martin Place bank headquarters is being refurbished, has been refurbishing itself for quite a number of months now. And I was there because I was escorting a team of students for the Australasian Economics competition, which we do, the Economics Olympiad competition, which we run every year. It was very exciting. And so we brought these students, 5 Australian students and 5 Singaporean and 5 New Zealanders, there to the bank, and we gave them the opportunity to ask questions and hear about what it was like to be an employee at the bank and what does a bank handle and whatnot. And I took the opportunity to ask, look, there's a lot of news these days about digital currencies and some fear out there in some quarters that perhaps we're going to accelerate ourselves here in Australia to become a cashless society. And people are, in some quarters anyway, worried about that. Does the bank actually have plans to go fully, digital and to basically abandon cash? And this was after I had been told, that the whole group had been told that, people are still using cash. And there was, in fact, a guy up there on the panel who was in charge of analyzing the quality of the currency in circulation. So making sure that, like, all of our bills, roughly all of our bills, that there's a high threshold of quality so that, you're less likely to have counterfeit bills and you're less likely to have just dirty bills and things like this. And so, obviously his job is predicated on the existence of cash, right? And so, we talked about that a bit, and I was just, trying to scan the future. And I was told, look, as long as people demand cash, we will not abandon it.
Wow.
So the bank, at least in that room, the bank was expressing its service role, which I think is very appropriate, towards the people of Australia to say, look, whatever you guys want, we're going to support. I do think that it would have been wise, it is wise, to have a kind of custodianship role informed by the economics of the situation that says, look, even if there aren't that many people demanding it, to sort of make it economic to continue having cash, perhaps we should anyway, because it's a good option to preserve for all the reasons that we talked about, right? To be able to have an equitable financial mechanism for people who are otherwise excluded from financial markets, to protect ourselves against outages, electrical and otherwise, technical and whatnot. And of course, just to give people, an option to store value in their homes if they want to do it that way. Just, it's something that allows people freedom. So, for all those reasons, I actually think the bank should take even a more proactive stance and say, look, we're not going to get rid of cash, but to track its use is a reasonable thing, because of course you want to put as much into circulation as you actually need to for the demand that you're experiencing.
Well, I mean, what that comes down to is basically they're saying that the responsibility is on us. For as long as the metrics, for as long as the numbers are showing that cash is in demand, if we put them into a situation where cash usage went up and more needed to be put into circulation, that would send a pretty clear signal. I've got to admit, I've been slacker than I could have been in terms of this using cash thing. I enjoy the convenience. Actually, it's not even the convenience of the moment. For me, it's the convenience of the paperwork afterwards, tracking all the tax and this and that, having all the transactions there and just showing up in the bank account. That's actually the thing that's convenient for me. And paying in cash and having to keep receipts and do it all that way is an absolute pain in the backside, in my opinion. But I'm going to have to change my attitude, because it's very, very clear that the responsibility is on us. It's now come from the Reserve Bank directly through you, Professor Gigi Foster. So thank you so much for bringing us this story, and thank you for coming on the Aussie Wire. We really appreciate it. We will have you back soon to talk about what you're doing with the University of New South Wales.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Topher.
Well, I'm pretty sure by now you're aware that there's a referendum coming up. Who knew, right? No one's ever heard anything about that in the news or all over social media or celebrities speaking out or all kinds of noise coming at you from every single imaginable direction. Thankfully, it's going to all be over in just a couple of weeks' time. Thank God for that. However, if you thought that now that the early voting booths are open, that all of the noise and fury would die down while we headed towards the actual polling day, you'd be very, very sadly wrong. In fact, if anything, things are starting to get a little bit weird. And the person that brought this to my attention was a regular here on the Aussie Wire and a giant of independent journalism in his own right, Rukshan Fernando. He joins me now. Rukshan, thank you for coming on the Aussie Wire again.
Great to be here, Topher. Great to be here.
Now, I've asked you to come on to cover this story because I think you've just done absolutely outstanding work on this. Talk me through, what are we looking at here? This is, I've pulled this off Twitter. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, well, that is trickery and deception, in my opinion. So this is we're seeing the AEC sign there for the voting center in their branded purple colors, and right next to it, you'd be I'd forgive you if you thought there was also a AEC sign behind it, which says "Vote Yes," and that is actually from the Yes 23 campaign for the referendum. So, clearly, what we're getting right now, one of the discussion points is whether it's exactly the same color. It's exactly the same type of, shade. It's almost exactly the same type of font as well. And they're being placed very close proximity. At least they were at the very start of early voting. So I think that's very problematic because obviously, the argument is that this can mislead people who are going to the voting booths. And I can definitely see that happening. So this is, trickery and deception, in my opinion.
Well, you made the effort to actually go in and compare the tone, the shade of purple on both, and they are for all.
Well, I am a wedding photographer, so this is my craft. So when I saw this, the first thing I did was fire up Photoshop, put it in there, and see actually how close the designers that were editing this actually took it. And look, there was a slight variation in it, but when they were choosing these colors, they did pick it from the very, same similar range. And, it looks very deliberate to me.
To the naked eye, it's almost impossible to see the difference. Now, the logos, of course, the AEC logo is an outline of Australia. The Yes Campaign's logo is an outline of Australia with some colours added in. The fonts, as you point out, incredibly similar. I mean, what also amazes me, this reaches to London. This is an image from London. You can see the double-decker London taxi cab there. What do you know about what's happening over there?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've had a lot of posts, like thanks to the, internet and a lot of users on X in particular, we're getting these, almost intelligence reports from overseas about what's happening at these voting centers. And you are seeing these yes signs being stuck almost like in this particular picture, right next to the AEC sign. And, it literally reads like it's a voting center for yes votes. And there might be people, I mean, a lot of people look at this and go, well, what's the big deal, right? But, in our community, there might be people that interpret that as that just a place where you vote yes. There's all sorts of other miscommunications that can happen because of this signage. But all in all, I don't think it's fair to be doing this type of thing. So there's that aspect to it as well. And I think, this Yes 23 campaign are just pushing the boundaries of what they can get away with. Well, and thanks to people bringing it up online, we've been able to kind of catch them out very early on.
This is the crux of it, isn't it? It's what they can get away with. Now, we've seen the AEC be very protective of the AEC rules. There are rules that are designed to ensure that messaging and communication within election campaigns, and that is what a referendum is. It's a type of election campaign, are fair and clear, and people know who's speaking and who's where are these messages coming from. And so, for example, I had to take down videos when I ran as a Senate candidate for the Libertarian Party in Tasmania. I had to take down videos of mine that lacked the authorisation statement. The fact that I'd put those videos up before I became a candidate was irrelevant. Now that I was a candidate, I had to take down a bunch of my own work. We saw the UAP being, actually, I believe an injunction was put against them where they took immediate action and said, no, you have to remove all these signs because we're not happy about the size of the authorisation statement, the size of the writing. So the authorisation statement was there, but because they felt it was too small, they actually actively took an injunction, which they then lost in court, by the way. The AEC lost that court case against the United Australia Party over that one. So they've been in the past very jealous of the rules and very protective. What's been the response from the AEC given these images that they're now being shown?
Yeah, they've kind of done this thing where they've almost acknowledged that there could be a problem, but, we've got to throw our hands up. There's not much we can do. We've contacted them and told them to keep it 6 meters away. But that's about it. And the problem with that type of enforcement is what we're seeing is on the first day, okay, maybe they did it and they got a warning from the AEC, and the next day you'd think they wouldn't do it, but they were doing it the next day.
Correct.
And they're probably doing it today as well.
Correct.
And there are also instances where they're being told to move it, they're moving it, and a few hours later, someone else is coming there and putting it back. So, once the AEC gets into this type of enforcement where it's like, can you please do something without actually following through with it? The other sides, the yes side in this case, are going to try to flaunt those rules when they can, and they seem to be doing it willy-nilly at the moment.
Now, the question arises, did they know that this was going to be so similar? Did they think that there would be a risk of misinterpreting where those messages came from? Did they perhaps indeed design it that way? And that might sound a little bit conspiratorial, but this was an incredible piece of work of yours. Now, you had a whistleblower come forward and bring this to your attention, I believe.
Yeah, look, a lot of people have been discussing this kind of in passing. I've kind of seen this mentioned because a lot of the time when you bring this up, particularly people on the left of politics, they'll bring up this older case of the Liberal Party actually engaging in something very similar. But when you look actually closer into it, and you look at the person behind it, that was the Victorian State Secretary, I believe at the time, or acting State Secretary Simon Frost. Yeah. So this guy is actually the guy who's the CEO of the Yes 23 campaign at the moment. So when you kind of mirror these two things together, and you see that his past statement was that he was fully aware of what he was doing by using the purple colors when he was in the Liberal Party for that particular campaign. I think it was purple colors with the Chinese text. So he knew, and he admitted that we did it for this particular reason, to make it look like this way. So when you look at now as the CEO of the Yes 23 campaign, I'm not saying he directly did anything. We don't know any of these things, but there's a bit of a pattern here, right? And there's a bit of coincidence here that seems very, points in a certain direction. And now you're seeing with this particular campaign, the very start of polling, the first day of the early voting, what do they have? These purple signs right there, right at the front. And this was across everywhere. So I actually went out to my local polling areas on that first day, and it was a purple colored yes signs that they had right in front of the voting center signs. Now, this was not a mistake because they had other colors printed and they had all that done as well. So they kind of, in my opinion, I believe they planned for this. They were testing the waters. They tried it out, and they were trying to see what they could get away with. And this is, what we're dealing with at the moment.
Well, the AEC, by responding the way they have, they've actually come out and said, "Oh, look, we don't really have enforcement powers. We can just make requests, etc." They've given tacit permission for this to continue, and we do see it continuing. A lot of these images are from yesterday. This is after the AEC came out and said, "Oh, look, there's not a lot we can do about this." We're seeing more and more images. If you jump online, jump onto X especially, you'll find a lot of these sorts of images. But you're absolutely right. The Guardian. This is not speculation. The Guardian reported that Simon Frost stated that his intent was to make Chinese language readers of that material think that it had come from the AEC. That's my reading of this Guardian article here. That's not speculation. Then we have the Sydney Morning Herald article here, and this was your work to dig this up. Rukshan, Simon Frost was brought on for the job of making sure that the campaign had a lot of visibility on the ground. Well, I would say that if you measure his success based on visibility on the ground, he's definitely succeeded in that regard.
That's correct. And we have to, it's not just the signs, actually. They actually had purple merchandise, purple tops, and, they've taken down the purple merchandise as reported by Sky News from their website as well. So there was this kind of, co-opting of the AEC brand that they were trying to push through. And luckily, again, users picked up on it. The AEC, for whatever reason, seems like because I've heard that you actually have to submit some of this material to the AEC prior as well. I'm not sure if that was the case in this particular instance, but if that's the case, the AEC possibly saw all this beforehand as well, which makes this even more telling how useless the AEC has been in this instance.
Well, I can't comment on that, but I do want to comment on this in closing. Now, Senator Jared Rennick brought this to my attention via X. Now, this is an example of, let's just say, if I was to say to you, Rukshan, for example, "Oh, did you know that the security cameras at the local supermarket aren't working? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge." You would understand what I'm trying to imply, right? Without me having said go and steal stuff from the local supermarket, you would understand what I'm trying to imply. I've got to say, I feel like there's a bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge going on in this tweet from the AEC. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Let me read it out, and then you tell me what you think. Am I reading too much into this? From the AEC. If someone votes at two different polling places within their electorate and places their formal vote into the ballot box at each polling place, their vote is counted. And then they go on to sort of give more information and basically confirming that you can vote multiple times and those votes will be counted. Is this a wink, wink, nudge, nudge?
Well, I mean, when you first look at this, it appears that way, right? It almost appears like an instructional on how to do multiple voting. But the broader problem here is the AEC actually maintains a very large social media presence in their efforts to dispel what they call misinformation, disinformation. And in doing that, inadvertently, they actually spread misinformation and disinformation. I don't think they're very effective communicators. And I've had this discussion with the AEC on X back and forth about this. The fact that when they write these short messages like this, where they're talking about, multiple voting, for instance, the most simplest thing they have to say is multiple voting is illegal. They don't need to give the instructional. They can point to a website or they can expand on it in one single paragraph or tweet. If they can't do that on Twitter, they shouldn't be doing that because this particular tweet, I think it's almost had 1 million views. It's gone viral all around the world. And people are looking at Australia like it's some sort of banana republic where the actual electoral commission in this country is putting online, telling people that you can go vote multiple times. Now, of course, they've come back and said, well, there's, safety protocols in place to kind of catch double voting and all this kind of stuff. But when we look at this in the totality of all the things which are going on right now, and in particular, the real, I think, genuine mistrust that a lot of people have in our institutions, when you see this kind of thing being said by the Electoral Commission during a very important referendum in our country, I think we lose confidence in the actual entire process. So they're not covering themselves in glory while they attempt to be, witty and, because, AEC on Twitter, it's good to have them there. It's good to have this official presence answering questions.
Sure.
But a lot of the times they insert their own biases and personality into some of these messages. And they're very kind of witty and they try to be funny. They try to be very personable. And I think although it's, funny for some people to look at that and be like, oh, that's great, they're engaging with the public. Actually, what we need from people like the AEC is for them to be very official. Very proper in the way that they make these communications. So very simply, all they have to say is it's illegal in Australia to vote twice. And we don't need to know the details of how you can go do it and what these things are. That can be expanded in a longer form and not on these shorter things like X or Twitter.
Well, sure. I mean, it's illegal, but they can't stop you from doing it. They've stated they can't stop you from doing it. They've stated that your vote will still get counted. And I happen to know from research that I've done in the past in trying to understand the size of the multiple voting problem here in Australia, that almost no one gets punished for it. It's very easy for someone to argue.
No prosecution, really.
And there's no prosecution, and someone can simply say, "Oh, that wasn't me. That was somebody else used my name," because we don't have to show ID when we vote here in this country. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to prove after the fact, and that from the AEC. I've defended the AEC in the past. I actually defended the AEC over the tick versus cross issue. I actually think that they are correct on that issue based on the legislation that they have to respond to, and I defended them on that basis. But this, for me, is indefensible. This, to me, appears to be official election interference.
Look, there should definitely be, some sort of accountability for this. The problem with the AEC is they rely on this mystique that they have about them being almost untouchable as an organization. But like you said, there's been multiple issues in the past where we've seen types of political bias come through. So there needs to be accountability for these type of actions and these type of messages as well. And we're not really getting that. We're getting more almost like, the next day they almost double down on this. And they're blaming everyone else. They're blaming people for not understanding the context of what they're saying. And I don't think they should be engaging in that. And like you said, it's very questionable what they've done here.
Ruxan Fernando, please keep up the great work. Please keep bringing these issues to the attention of the Aussie Wire and to Australia generally. We'll put your links into the description of this video so that people can follow you. And thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Cheers, Topher.
Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we've been keeping a close eye on developments in the UK, but of course that is halfway around the world from us, and as much as I will be taking a team to the launch of the ARC in London in less than a month's time, I thought I'd get the inside running from someone who's on the ground. We've met him before here on the Aussie Wire. He is our wonderful and very gracious UK correspondent, Alex Story. Alex, welcome back to the Aussie Wire.
It's good to bring me back.
Now, This is a really interesting moment in history, I would say, in the UK and in London. We've seen, obviously, grabbing a lot of headlines, not so much in the mainstream media, but in the alternative media, have been these Blade Runners, but also net zero, which is tied in with what they're doing, has been in the headlines for quite some time. And we've recently seen some big shifts from the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak with regard to deadlines, etc., around that. Can you bring us up to speed for those that may not be familiar with what's happening over in the UK? And I want to talk about why I think this is incredibly significant as a moment in history.
What we're seeing is a slight shift, which like all things, starts with a little bit of hesitation rather than hurling yourself down straight for the final target. You start to you slow down and you look around and you ask yourself whether what you're trying to do is actually beneficial or not. I think what you're seeing in the UK is a politician who is really not that popular for a variety of reasons, who's starting to pick up that actually net zero is not popular at all either. So he's got a few options in front of him, and one of them is to try and sound as if he's going to do something that helps the masses of our citizens. And one of the things that he's done is that he's pushed away, in theory, the end game of net zero, which is an 80% or 60% cut of CO2 emissions down from what it used to be in 1990. And so what that's done is that it kind of propped him up a little bit in the poll. So his poll numbers have kind of risen slightly. That he's still massively behind in the polls, but at least there is hope for him that if he keeps going down that track, he might at least not be completely annihilated at the next general elections.
So give me a bit of history here, because we were just chatting off air earlier, and I wasn't aware the UK were you were saying the very first to really sign up to net zero, and it's an incredible amount of emissions reductions compared to 1990s levels. What are some of the policies we've seen being pursued to try and deliver on that promise?
So that's one of the things that I think surprised me as well when I was researching it. Is that the 2008 Climate Act was passed by the UK Parliament. And the idea at the time was to reduce carbon emissions by 80% from the 1990 base. What's interesting is that we've already, in Britain, got down to 60% cuts from 1990, which is staggering.
It's phenomenal.
And of course, what you see is that...
Sorry, can I pause you there? Because I do want to explore that just for a moment. In order to, this is on 1990 levels, where the population of the United Kingdom was considerably lower than what it is now. How has that been achieved? Has there been just a total deindustrialization of the United Kingdom?
That's a really, really interesting point. And I think that's partially the story. And it's part of this idea that we have, where we have a lot of theorists and not a lot of practitioners. We have people who've decided that you can export the pollution by essentially subcontracting manufacturing, agricultural production, energy production as well. And so what we see is that actually on the altar of net zero, we've sacrificed our industrial capability. What's interesting about 1990 is that 60% of our energy came from coal. Whatever you think about coal, what it suggests is that in 1990, Britain was completely energy independent. And this thing that in the 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century would have been seen as an extreme positive has been cast aside. And the idea is, so long as we can have energy, no matter where it comes from, and net zero is a worthwhile endeavor to pursue. And I think that's something you've got to try and focus on, because what we've sacrificed is our energy independence on the altar of a target. And of course, the question for me, and perhaps for you, is having cut down emissions by 60%, which puts us at the front of the pack of Western countries, is, are we happier as Brits now than we were then? And the answer is probably not.
So what we've seen, and what really caught my attention recently, and we've reported on a few times here on the Aussie Wire, has been this almost instantaneous, almost overnight, or at least that's how it looked from over here, emergence of this Blade Runners movement. For those that don't know, these are people that are spontaneously organising amongst themselves to sabotage cameras related to an ultra-low emissions zone. It's a very specific piece of policy. It was a London mayor, London city policy, but it seems to be symptomatic of a much bigger, overall pushback. And it strikes me as quite quite a significant shift. Can you bring us up to speed? What was the ultra-low emission zone policy? What's this pushback been? And do you share my view that it might actually be the beginning of quite a big social movement?
The ultra low emission zones is essentially an extension of the congestion charge. And I remember back in the day when it was introduced at the beginning of the millennium, that I used to say to people, don't accept a tax on your ability to move around unless there's a proper alternative. But of course, people got like the idea that it would only be in a restricted zone. But actually, what happens is that it's initially restricted. But of course, as we all know, with bureaucracies, it's hungry for more cash, and so what it does is that it expands. So the ULEZ, the ultra low emission zone, is essentially the product of a process that we understand always happens when government is involved. It wants more resources. And so the reason why I think the Blade Runners are interesting is because they understand something that we all understand, perhaps not explicitly though, but intuitively, and that's that there is no discussion with government in the 21st century in the Western world. The governments and administrations of Western countries go about their business regardless of whether they have our consent or not. And I think this destruction of the seeking consensus with the people that you rule over is essentially what we're now seeing. That's the backlash, which is people just going, okay, well, if you're not going to listen to what we're saying, we will have to take things into our own hands. And of course, the interesting thing is that the administrators of City Hall in London are saying, if you do this, it's criminal damage. Of course, if you have problems with this, you should petition your MPs. You should write emails of complaints in the press, etc., etc. But the point is, they know that these suggestions are completely disingenuous because they know that whatever the citizens of London do in terms of protesting to their MPs or to their local councillors is not going to do anything. So they're asking the people of London to go through the routes that they themselves have essentially blocked by completely ignoring the citizens' concerns. And in the end, if you don't seek consensus, you put yourself in a position of confrontation. And that's where I think we're going slowly.
I'm nearly finished writing a book on the issue of civil disobedience based on the lessons that I learnt during the lockdown period in Melbourne. And I look at London, I look at the Blade Runners, and in some senses I'm a little bit jealous because there seems to have been a spontaneous movement that really gained a lot of momentum very, very quickly. And I would have liked to have seen the same thing in Melbourne during the lockdowns. What do you think this points to? Is this a genie out of the bottle? Once it's out, you can't put it back in?
But the thing is about human beings is you can't always control the dynamics. It's difficult to say. ULEZ is something very specific. It's essentially saying to an Englishman that he is charged for going from one part of the country to the other for no particular reason. So Sadiq Khan talks about the lives being saved by ULEZ, but it's completely it's a non sequitur. It can't be possibly true. We all know that the air in London is so much cleaner than it ever was, not least because of, as I said, the emissions targets that have been reached in Britain since 1990. So the entire thing is essentially an exercise in robbing the Londoner from two things. First, from his hard-earned cash, because it's essentially about £4,500 a year extra to do exactly what he was doing before ULEZ was introduced for free. So this extra cost hits people in the pocket. And the other thing is that it's creating boundaries within the UK, which might or might not be seen. And so that means that you'll be punished by the state for thinking that you're a free man traveling in a free country. And so ULEZ is something that could trigger a greater movement, but certainly it points to something that I think is probably inevitable if you consistently seek to undermine the people of your own country and never seek a consensus with them. If you believe that you're right and that your own people are wrong, and you keep showing them that, in the end, a compromise is no longer possible.
It's interesting times indeed, and I don't think I've ever seen a movement like the Blade Runners emerge in an English-speaking country in my lifetime. And I'll be watching with a great deal of interest. I'm looking forward to getting to London, and I'm trying to line up some meetings with some of those people. Obviously, they're trying to keep their identities hidden, but I'm hoping to be able to do some interviews with some of the people that are actually engaged in this civil disobedience and learning and understanding more about what's happening. Certainly, I hope that what we're seeing, as you alluded to earlier, with this perhaps hesitation in the rush to net zero might be the beginning of a shift in politics for the UK. Last question for you, Alex. The United Kingdom really is, if we trace back the history of our political freedoms and the ideas of human rights, etc., we've inherited them from England. Obviously, it then goes back to Greece and other places. These ideas are not necessarily new, but we inherited them through the United Kingdom. I would argue the United Kingdom now has charged headlong down a very dystopian route. We see people going to prison over Facebook posts and all sorts of things like this. Do you consider, as someone who lives there, do you think that freedom is a lost cause, a lost idea in the UK, or do you think that the UK could return to that place of being a real home of freedom?
I think the important thing is always to remember where we came from. Certainly philosophically, the fact is that currently the state in Britain has been permeated by people who are very, very attracted with totalitarianism, and of course what that means is that the view that they have is that technology increases their power. But of course, that's only true if you call yourself a progressive. And in order to make your point and to force what you think is better, you have to ignore the past. And of course, our job is to always remember and to remind people of where we came from and the cost of freedom and of liberty. And so at the moment, what we have is a state that is perhaps high on the power it thinks it has because of technology. And what we have is a mass of people who will always prefer liberty over coercion. But as we saw during COVID, we are a pliable people because inherently and in our DNA, we have grown up thinking that we can trust the state. And so the danger with those people who permeate our administration and who are in fact Maoists is that they are dismantling something that has built up over century, which is trust in the state. The moment that dissipates, and I would say that we are at that moment, is when society becomes more and more difficult to govern. And where it leads to is the gamble that our administrators are taking.
Well, Alex Story, UK correspondent, thank you so much for your time here tonight. This is a story we will stay on top of. And Alex, you've just wonderfully agreed to allow us to syndicate some of your wonderful articles and blogs that you write over in the UK. So we're going to start to see Alex's writing appearing on the blog on the Aussie Wire's website as well, the aussiewire.com, if you'd like to check that out. Alex Story, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com, follow all of our socials via @theaussiewire, and become an insider, that's a financial supporter of the Aussie Wire, to get giveaways, discounts, exclusive content, and much more. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.